This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today is Saturday. That means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. March of the Machine has been out for a while now, and I think that means it's time for me to do my tier list for the various color pairs in the format. This is sort of a companion piece to the archetype guide to do at the beginning of a format before actually playing with the cards, just looking at the synergies that are present within the set. This is where I'm saying, this is how good I think each of them are, this is how they work, and I talk about both at least one signpost uncommon and one signpost common of sorts for every one of the color pairs. So let's dive in to look at these tiers. I actually have 3 different tiers this time. That's a good thing because at least the last 2 sets, I think, have had decks that were in tier 4, which meant don't draft them unless something crazy happens. And, that wasn't good for those formats necessarily, that there wasn't There were some decks that were basically, undraftable is a strong word, but pretty close. And this format doesn't have any of those. Every color pair in the format is viable. If it's open, you can get a pretty good deck. But these tiers sort of represent the decks that have the highest ceiling, the ones that come together the most consistently. So we'll start with the very top tier. I think the best deck in the format, although I think all 3 of these are a little interchangeable, but right now I feel like the number 1 deck at the top of tier 1 in the format is blue-white. So this is a night deck. This format, not every color pair is really strong on synergy, and there really isn't any color pair that's really strong on synergy in terms of the mechanical theme, but they're all sort of sub-themes at least, and that's certainly the case here. Blue-white, like I said, it's about the night creature type, and in general, it's a tempo deck. You want to curve out early, and you want to do stuff that makes it so your opponent can't block effectively. And that just can win you the game, especially because this format does have a lot of mid-range and control decks. This deck can run them over fairly consistently, and part of that is that the color pair has 2 really, really good commons that are night payoffs between Swordsworn Cavalier and Protocol Knight. The Cavalier is hard to block for a whole lot of the game if you just keep playing Knights because of First Strike, and Protocol Knight can get a blocker out of the way for a whole turn cycle and really wreak havoc on your opponent. So these 2 commons are really, really good, and they're really what define this deck. There are other things you can do. Once your opponent can start blocking you like to start using combat tricks. Those are really good in this deck, especially the 2 really good white ones. The one that gives +2/+2 in flying, as well as the one that gives a counter and protection. That works well here. But this deck just has a lot of curve outs that just are unstoppable because they just keep doing things to tempo you out, bouncing your things, tapping them with the Bola Slinger and stuff. And it can just really snowball with a whole bunch of commons and just run you over. And that's what I think makes it the best deck overall. Like I said, I do think these top 3 are sort of interchangeable. I wouldn't really argue with anyone who says any of these top 3 are the best deck in the format the most consistently. So, they are pretty close. After blue-white, I have blue-black. So this is on the other end of the spectrum. This is a control deck. And the sub-theme here is mill, and it's about milling yourself and milling your opponent and getting value out of it. Your signpost uncommon here lets you take advantage of the graveyard by casting something, a spell from a graveyard if you pay the sort of extra kicker cost. And that is a really strong signpost. The blue-white has a strong one too. As usual, pretty much all the signposts are really good. But this one does an excellent job of showing you, the deck is about getting 2-for-1s. The deck is about grinding out value, milling you and your opponent. Most of the mill is symmetrical. I have the key common here as Halo Charged Scob. You could include a lot of things here, but I think this one embodies what this deck is about perhaps the most effectively of any common in the set, in that it has this symmetrical mill effect, and then it gets you back a spell from your graveyard, and that ends up being pretty nice. Can be a battle too. This deck can also just mill people out because of Halo Charge Scob. It's kind of a win condition in the deck sometimes. Most of the time, games go long when you're playing this deck. I have a 3-hour draft video or something with one really good blue-black deck from early in the format that, they can take a really long time. And so if you're playing all these symmetrical mill cards, every turn, it seems like sometimes, eventually both decks are pretty small. But if you have Halo Charge Scob, it can keep you from milling yourself out and make sure your opponent does mill themselves out. So you end up with kind of a lock. I mean, a lock is a strong word, but it's sort of a plan B. And the card also rebuys your removal and stuff. You get it back into your deck, and that's what this deck wants to do. You want to be countering things with a couple of good counter spells in the format, killing things, and then winning the long game with value generated from like attacking battles. Like the Invasion of Amonkhet is maybe the best non-rare mythic battle in the set. And so, you just grind out a bunch of value, lots of symmetrical mill, and you can get so much value out of your graveyard and your opponents. And so it ends up being a really strong deck. The format doesn't have that much graveyard hate, which also helps this deck thrive a little bit more. So, so far we have a tempo deck and a control deck in this top tier. They're sort of on opposite ends of the spectrum. The last deck in tier 1 I have is Blue-Red Convoke. Another tempo deck, although this one can lean in a grindier direction. Blue-White can't really. It is sort of one track in terms of what it does. And I think that's true of Blue-Black largely too. You can't really have like a Blue-Black tempo aggro deck and do that well. But you can have a Blue-Red Convoke deck that is grindier. I do think probably the best versions are the more aggressive ones, where you can quickly populate the board and power out really good spells with your extra bodies. I have the Signpost Uncommon here gives you 3 bodies, which is great for Convoke. And if you didn't get that this card is already about Convoke, it tells you it is, because when you cast things with Convoke, you get to do 1 to your opponent and any battles they're protecting. The key common here, I think, is Rawl's Reinforcements. You could include some common cards with Convoke too, but most of them are honestly good in like every deck. And Rawl's Reinforcements is okay in pretty much every deck, but in Blue-Red and to a lesser extent Black-Red is where it can really thrive. Because if you play a 1-drop and then play this on turn 2, you can set up all kinds of possibilities with Convoke cards, whether it's the one that you're using to time ebb something into your opponent's library, whether you're getting close to casting the big dragon, which is pretty easy to do on turn 4, the 4/4 dragon with flying and haste. You can do it pretty consistently on turn 4 with this deck. And then you have access to lots of cheap interaction that can help you push through damage quickly. Like I said, you can definitely go a grindier route with this deck. I mean, your Signpost Uncommon costs 5, so it's not exactly telling you should be curving out and then using all this extra Convoke to go crazy. But I do think the ones that are a little more aggressive, casting tempo spells with your Convoke stuff rather than, card draw spells maybe, is what you end up doing a little more with this deck. Although the card draw spell is also pretty good. So that's tier 1. We've got Blue-White Knights, Blue-Black Mill, which is a control deck. Knights is a tempo deck. And then Blue-Red Convoke, which can kind of be a mid-range deck or a tempo, more aggressive deck. I've seen both work pretty well. So that's tier 1. You may notice that all of these decks are blue, and that is, the format's not perfect. Blue is significantly better than every other color, which is not something we see a lot, at least. So at least it's a color that's not usually coming out on top in Limited. Because, yeah, when all the best decks in the format are blue, that does, it's not necessarily great design. Though I do think this format is a very, very good one. So that's tier 1. Tier 2, here the theme is that most of the decks are green. So, yeah, that's kind of interesting that we have it divided this way. So the top deck I have in tier 2 is red-green. And these decks largely are less synergistic than the ones we've already talked about. Things with Convoke, you want those in your deck if you're playing blue-red. Things that mill you or pay you off for your opponent having enough cards in their graveyard are what you want in blue-black. And things that say Knight on them or in the text box or both are what you want a lot in blue-white. This second tier is mostly made up of kind of decks where it's even less of a sub-theme, I guess. And in the case of red-green, we're talking about a deck that is kind of supposed to be battles. That's the mechanical theme. And it does have access to lots of really good battles. And the battles are central to what the deck does. But a lot of the cards that actually pay you off for doing battle things haven't turned out to be that good. Whether it's the 4 mana 4/3 Menace, or the 3 mana 3/3 with Reach, or the 2 mana 2/2, all of them get some buff, when they attack a battle, and they're all okay, but you don't really go all in on that strategy with this deck. You end up being more of a sort of mid-rangey deck that grinds out value eventually from attacking battles. More aggressive decks in this format are a lot less interested in most of the battles. This is a deck that is interested in these grindy red and green battles and finding ways to defeat them. But, and that's one of the big ways it pulls ahead, by flipping a battle in the mid game, and suddenly their board is a lot scarier. I put as the key common here, this one was a little hard for me to sort of narrow down. In the end, I went with Wildwood Escort because I think it does a good job of conveying the grindy nature. I mean, this is a 5 mana 3/3 that gets you a thing back from your graveyard. That's not exactly like an aggressive card, but it also shows you that this deck can, you can get a battle back, for example, or you can get a creature back. Either way, that ends up being a really good play in this particular deck. Your creatures end up being larger than decks like blue-white or blue-red by the mid to late game. And, if you manage to weather the early game, you can usually overpower them. And then, you do okay against the control decks in the format too. So it's a nice grindy deck that gets most of its value out of having good battles and being able to attack them in the later mid to late game. Blue-green is next. So the theme here is supposed to be double-faced cards, and it's kind of there, but I think this is just the best base for the multicolor decks in the format, and I think that's true of blue-green, black-green. Blue-green and black-green are the two sort of best bases for playing like a 3-4-5 color control deck, because you have access to really good fixing in blue. In this case, you get access to card draw. You get access to the best commons and uncommons in the set too, as we've already discussed. So that's really good. The double-faced theme is definitely there, and I think one of the key cards for this deck, and a card that does help make it good for these multicolor decks as a base, is Overgrown Pest. This is a 3 mana 2/2 that ends up drawing you a land or a double-faced card. It lets you go deep enough in your library that, while it's not quite, you shouldn't count it as a source of fixing. If you are playing a 4 or 5 color deck, where your base is somewhere in green, this can help you find your dual lands or whatever you need to fix your mana. And the way you end up in these sorts of, 3, 4, 5 color decks is by, opening multiple insane bombs, of which there are plenty in the format. And usually if you're in one of these decks, it's kind of like the domain decks back in Dominaria, when you end up in a one of these rampy, well, not rampy, I mean, they have some ramp, but they're more about fixing and making the game go long and casting a bunch of haymakers. And the way you end up there is, ending up opening up or getting past really good bombs that you think you can cast. You do need like cheaper, you need cheap removal to get you to that stage of the game, and usually cheap, easy to cast removal. One of the nice things about blue-green is that you have access to the Convoke spell that lets you, bounce or time ebb rather, a opposing creature. So yeah, I mean, this is sort of a double-faced card deck, but I don't think you ever really end up in a deck where you're like, I really got there on having these double-faced cards, and that's what's going to win me the draft. Not really. I mean, the double-faced cards are already inherently good for the most part, so that ends up helping. But I do think the best versions of this deck are playing, like full-on playing 1 to 2 other colors. Similarly, I already mentioned that black-green is another really good base for doing multicolored things. This deck is sort of about having a bunch of incubators, and big incubators especially. Like you're in this deck, you're more interested in the 4 or 5 mana cards that give you a big incubator, like Tangled Skyline and stuff like that. And I think here the key common for me is Blighted Burgeoning. So like I said, I think blue-green and black-green are probably the two best places to do this sort of multicolored thing. And Blighted Burgeoning for both of these decks is part of it. I think it is a little bit better here because this deck can get more value out of incubators, so that's why I have it as the key common. But this thing has just been really good. You add to the board, you fix your mana, you ramp your mana. It ends up making casting things so much easier. And it's a card you really want to go after most of the time if you're in this deck. And blue-green and black-green can do okay as two-color decks, but they definitely get better once you're splashing powerful removal and bombs and stuff like that. And that's where they can really thrive. Next up, I've got black-red. So this is a sacrifice deck. I do think it's a little more synergistic than the other decks we've looked at so far. And generally, a lot of the sacrifice decks we've seen lately are like aggressive ones. This one's not really. It's more of a grindy sort of sacrifice deck that can, win longer games by generating a ton of value by sacrificing things. And I think the Signpost Uncommon does a pretty good job of conveying that. And if you've built a pretty good deck, around and have this Signpost Uncommon in it, it's going to have a lot of things to sacrifice and draw you cards and gain counters. I mean, if it's left unchecked, it just takes over most games in this deck. Obviously, it's not really a card that's going to take over in the early game. It's a card that can take over gradually, as you draw more cards and have more things worth sacrificing. I mentioned earlier, Rawl's Reinforcements is also good here, and that's because it gives you 2 bodies to sacrifice to things. Marauding Dreadship is one I went with as the key common here. Gives you 2 things you can sacrifice, and the 4/1 body can often really represent a bunch of damage out of nowhere. You just end up with nice value from this card, and the fact it gives you these 2 artifacts really makes it so you're pretty happy playing it in this deck, and this is probably the best deck for it because of that. And then the last deck I have in the second tier is white-green. This is another one that, you can end up with a fairly synergistic version of it. It's a +1/+1 counter deck. That's supposed to be the idea. The main problem is there aren't that many good payoffs for doing those things at lower rarities, and this is another deck. I do think it's a little less well-suited to being a sort of a multicolor control deck than blue-green or black-green are, because they have the right tools. White-green, you're ending up sort of, adding white to the mix isn't exactly like a control color that makes you feel like you're going to be doing, well and making the game go long. So this deck is largely a more aggressive deck, It's significantly worse than blue-white or blue-red, which are these more streamlined tempo decks. You can do some silly stuff with +1/+1 counters in this deck sometimes, but you have to get uncommons to make it happen. If you do, things get crazy. But mostly, this just ends up being an aggro deck. You like playing tricks. You have some +1/+1 counter stuff going on. For that reason, I have the key common here as the name escapes me, but it'll be on the screen. The trick that gives +1/+1 counter, and you choose a color or colorless, and it gets protection. That ends up being good here, whether you have synergies or not, because you're going to be attacking a lot, and that card's just good in general. If you do end up in a multicolor deck with this, it's usually partly a result of Fertilid's Favor, which works well with the limited +1/+1 counter synergies you do have, and also fixes and ramps your mana. So, that's sort of if you end up in a grindier version of this deck, which is possible but not super likely, that can kind of be your key common. But most of the time, you're just like playing creatures that are good on curve and attacking your opponent with them and using tricks to mess up their blocks. So that's tier 2. These decks, they come together reasonably well. They're all quite good. They're just not on the same level as those tier 1 decks, which I think have a huge leg up on most of these. So let's move now to tier 3, where I do have, I think, what were supposed to be 2 aggro decks. So it's interesting because tier 1 has 2 tempo decks, which is a particular kind of aggro, I suppose. And then the bottom tier also has 2 fairly aggressive decks. The first of these is black-white, which is supposed to be like a Phyrexian deck, but one of the big problems here with that synergy is there is not a single common in the entire set that does anything for Phyrexians. You're reliant on uncommons and rares, and you can get them. Your Signpost Uncommon, for example, is very good. It buffs, all of your Phyrexians and gives you an incubator. So they're there, but they're not super easy to come by. And then you don't really have access to the same sort of tempo that blue can allow you to have. you just end up being a deck that like curves out, gets some incubators. You have access to good removal in both black and white, but you just don't really have the same punishing openings that blue-white can have as a result of all its things that just are impossible to block, or that blue-red can have as a result of Convoke. Instead, you're sort of limited to, playing like one card a turn that probably won't do anything until the next turn, which is okay, but it does make these decks significantly worse. I have the key common here as Ichor Drinker. I do think this is also really great, by the way, in black-red, because you can sack it and then get another thing. But in the end, I went with Marauding Dreadship there, because I think that works a lot better. That works quite well there. And Ichor Drinker works pretty well here. It's a Phyrexian initially. It gives you these 2 bodies, including an incubator. And, the value you can get out of that is pretty nice. But mostly, like I said, this is just like a black-white aggro deck. And it doesn't really have the same ability to just keep attacking no matter what your opponent does that blue-white and blue-red really do have. And then at the very bottom, I have red-white. So this has even less synergy going on for the most part. It is supposed to be a backup deck, as your Signpost Uncommon tells you, but it's really the only card in this set that very directly says something good happens when you do backup things. And, if you do end up playing this deck and you have a bunch of cards with backup and then you have like a bunch of the signposts, it can get really silly. I've had a deck where I think I had 3 of them, and, when you do just play that on turn 2, play something with backup on turn 3 and 4, you do usually just win. And that can really allow you to have, really good starts. But when you don't get that signpost, you just end up with a deck that has good, cheap creatures that can put counters on things. And again, these decks aren't bad. Like, all of these decks can be good, but what I'm saying is it's significantly worse than the other aggro decks we've talked about. I do think for here I have as the key common Bola Slinger. I mean, this slots into basically all the white decks, but the fact that it has backup and is really good when you're being aggressive was enough for me to include it here, because, this thing is just so good because it usually gives you 2 separate attacks where something just can't block you. So it does give you a little taste of what like blue-white can do if you have Bola Slinger. But yeah, so those are the tiers. Top tier, I have blue-white, blue-black, blue-red. Tier 2, red-green, blue-green, black-green, black-red, and white-green. And then tier 3, black-white, and red-white. No tier 4. Like I said, there's not a deck I would say mostly avoid drafting this, because it's not going to work. Every deck in the format can work. I think that's partly a result of their synergy being less emphasized here. One of the downsides about having like synergy be key is often that if you're missing 1 or 2 synergy pieces, your deck just isn't good. That does happen less here. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future content, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past content, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.